Hey, everybody, welcome to Experience Data Talk, a show featuring data science leaders and technologists from around the world. This is episode number 108, and today we get a chance to learn from Michael Gale. Michael is the author of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book, The Digital Helix, which is a book dealing with business transformation and ways to help your business thrive in our digital age. Michael is also the host of the Forbes Insights podcast called Futures in Focus, a show where he talks with visionaries and business leaders about how they are thinking about the future and ways they're helping to build it. His show covers topics like the future of food, printing human organs, the future of healthcare, and what education should look like. If you're interested in how our world is changing, you should definitely subscribe to the Futures in Focus podcast. In today's show, we talk with Michael about digital transformation and steps to help businesses and employees thrive in our digital age. Here's our conversation. Michael, I always like to start the shows by getting to know a little bit more about your journey and what led you to do what you're doing now.
I think it's funny because you always ask that question of others, and then when it's asked of you, you sort of get a little tingly, right? Because you have to be precise with it. So I suppose it starts,
Right.
It's like, oh, I actually have to answer a real question. I think it starts in two places. I'd run a big company, Micron, 5,000-6,000 employees. And I think one of the things I recognized, particularly what was then the PC business, is this constant march to efficiency. You know, I can breathe on less air than you can and make slightly more or less money than you can. But it was a sort of law of decreasing marginal returns. And you just can't, when you're sitting in your 30s, think, is this my life for the next 35 years? Getting better at progressively squeezing out more from less. I think at the same time, this is about 2000, I really understood that there's a different dynamic that's starting to drive the way people think. In other words, how can you put efficiency together with innovation? And then how do you change culture? Because if you bring those three things together, sort of magic can happen. And we saw it in some businesses we were buying that were hosting applications, a weird term now that we now call the cloud. And secondly, I built a business that we sold to Monitor Group, Michael Porter's company. And Michael was the king of squeeze more out of less. You know, A fights with B and hopefully A or B wins and then you get market share. What was very clear is that there was a sort of innovative process whereby if you built non-disruptive environment, you could actually change the shape of the world. So we did initial work with Amazon and Google. You sort of saw them really being not so much shape shifters, but shape changers. They were changing the way the world was thinking. And every company over that time period of about 2006 to really now wants to steal some of that DNA. What's the DNA inside Amazon and Google or Uber or any of these organizations that we can take as a traditional firm and actually make ourselves a digital platform? So we started doing work on the book about 2014, The Digital Helix. We got very lucky. It's a Wall Street Journal best-selling book on business strategy. And I realized that the paradox of the future is about innovation, it's about efficiency, and it's about customer service. It's this strange paradox of I can innovate and be efficient and serve customers. And there's a comment that Bezos once made to us was, the world is basically 7 billion segments. Every human being is its own segment, has its own sort of groups that it works in, its own sort of mores that it works for. You have to build a company that can service portions, chunks of those individual personalities. You can't do that in a factory model where you push one thing out and hopefully push it through. You sort of have to have multiple dimensions that come together. And so in order to do that, you had to rebuild the DNA of companies. So we did a lot of research, about $1 million worth, probably spent 4,000 hours literally sitting in buildings. I remember being in DC with the GSA, which is the largest procurement organization in the world. I think it's about the size of the 12th biggest economy in the world. And understanding how they were changing their DNA to suit a world that was very different, super fascinating. So the book really is like, you know, Crick and Watson or Watson's book on the Helix, because it takes what are relatively commonly understood terms and glues them together in a sort of three-dimensional model. So you're actually able to size how many companies do it right, how many intend to do it right but fail, how many wrap themselves digitally, really knowing they're not going to make it happen and they sort of fail. We came up with some pretty scary facts. So, for example, I look at the retail industry, super tight margins, super customer-centric, lives by the moment. About 40% of retail companies suck up about 60% of all the positive gains from the digital world. So whether it's in OPEX, CAPEX, SG&A, human capital, small firms like Zara, IKEA, who we interviewed last week, really are good at understanding this new digital dynamic in a way that honestly most major corporations like GE have really miserably failed with. So I think what the book has taught us is if you're a giant from the past, there's no guarantee you'll be a giant to the future. And you have to adopt a sort of 7-component digital DNA to give yourself a chance. And only about 28% of corporations actually get it. So you think about that success rate over the next 3 to 4 years. If those companies keep going, they will have sucked up over 50% of the growth in their own segments. So you can already see who's going to thrive, who might survive, and probably who's going to die in that time period. And it really is a choice. Every company is built roughly in the same way. So if you could understand how to alter that DNA to make it successful, you're going to work. And that's really what has motivated me, is how do you help transform companies to function in the 21st century, where actually companies are going to have to be more than just profit centers. We're going to have to look after communities, societies, social groups that we employ. We can't just be profit orientated. So all the stuff you've seen recently from Jamie Dimon and others says, okay, we get this. We're going to have to be better than just a company. We actually have to be part of making society good. You can't make society good unless you can actually transform yourself. Otherwise, it's sort of telling people to do things you're not succeeding with. And that is the short answer to the question.
I love that. What a brilliant! I love the way you brought that all together, because you've done a lot, and it's fascinating research you've been doing, and definitely speaks to what we're seeing today with workplaces that are trying to be more, promoting more employee groups, employee resource groups, diversity and inclusion, making sure that office spaces are a little more fun for employees, that they're socially conscious, encouraging employees to be out doing good in their communities. We kind of see all of that, because to your point, it's not just about profit. It's about how are we creating a better world and getting people to buy into that mission. So when they join a company, they're like, hey, I'm out here to not only, work on this widget and promote this widget, but I'm also here, right, to how is my company serving the community at large?
Yeah, and that's also, how do I develop as a human being? I mean, 2020 is a really interesting year, not just because it's the decade discussion. It's not just because we are, I think, in a climate crisis, and that's maybe a crisis of identity, but it's the first year that millennials, these people under the age of 35, dominate the workforce, not just here, but they dominate the workforce globally. So literally every country in the world, maybe Japan aside and possibly Italy, the millennial population will take over. We've just seen a millennial prime minister in Finland, 34-year-old, take over what is a small but super symbolic economy of the future. And, we have candidates here in the election that honestly sit at both ends of the age scale, one at 39, I think, one at 70 or 80 or 90, whatever. And I think there's a moment of definition. So when you think about work, millennials are going to work in 15 places, whereas boomers like me only worked in 5. That triples the pressure to make the right decision. And one of the things we wrote about in Forbes a while ago says, look, before you choose a company to work at, you got to work at how digitally transformed they are. Do they understand people? Do they understand careers? Are they themselves part of this new economy, or are they a drag to it? That's a really important selection process we never would have talked about 3, 5, 10 years ago. And the pressure we're putting on millennials isn't just at work, it's society, environment, forms of democratic capitalism. 1 in 4 millennials have to look after an elderly parent already. I mean, that's really scary when you think about the liabilities involved in it. So if companies can help people be better versions of themselves, because technology is free, we can get it wherever we want it. Human capital is actually the biggest differentiating value for most companies if they spend the time training it. And those companies that are digitally transforming really successfully and making all the net returns invest 3 times as much in their people as companies that don't. There's got to be some correlation in terms of investing in human capital.
As you've been kind of watching and doing all this research on various companies that are doing it right, what have been some examples or case studies you've seen of companies that are doing really good work with training up this next generation of leaders?
So I'll pick IKEA. We actually interviewed the chief digital officer there, Barbara Martin Coppola, a couple of weeks ago for a podcast. But there's work we've seen before that does 2 things. IKEA is a typical large box retailer. I mean, can't buy those big pieces of wood in a small van, right?
Yeah.
It's not difficult. But think about the converging world their sales associates have to deal with. Customer comes in, about 70% of them have already been online, have some precepts. They're looking to fill out an apartment or a house. Actually, that's getting progressively smaller over time. Space is expensive, so therefore we tend to contract. So the conversations they have, 10 years ago was, how much more can I sell you? How much more can I put in the basket? The conversation now has to be, how do I get you what you need, what you want, and what will help you maybe be better than you thought you could be when you came here? That's turning a sales associate conversation into a consultative discourse. So in order to empower that to happen, the technology, the knowledge about the customer, what product fits and doesn't fit in certain situations, requires a fundamentally different view of what that interaction is worth than the traditional, let me put it in the basket, let me find this for you, let me take you to the till. And I think retailers that have been successful have understood that the discourse is changing. It's becoming more like a luxury good conversation, even at the base level, than it was before. If you go to a Whole Foods or another upper end food store, conversation is really different. Well, Kroger, QFC, Safeway, Tesco, Sainsbury's in the UK, Carrefour, Fnac, are all trying to find ways of encouraging that conversation to be more adroit, highly personalized, and really in the moment. That requires a lot of technology and training to do it. And if you look at the organizations doing it right in retail, even in oil and energy, they're empowering their people to be very good in that sort of first line conversation by building infrastructure that works for them. So we talk a lot about how much you're investing in cloud or technology. The issue really is how much is that technology being used to make people better versions of themselves. So if you look at the new suites of collaboration software, the system we're using now, these forms of interaction and learning and training are really what corporations should be differentiating on. Those like IKEA or Lego or Zara, for example, in the retail industry, vastly outshine brands like Nordstrom, which have that traditional, I'll help you, but are increasingly paralyzed because the interactions aren't based on technology and knowledge. They're based on precepts and assumptions that don't really apply at an individual level. Clearly, you can look at Amazon, clearly you can look at Uber, but the future is about massive personalization, Jeff's 7 billion segments, and empowering people to get to that level. So whether or not it's a local plumber, I look, for example, Home Depot, really not a good organization in terms of personalization. Now, I want to know about a 1/4-inch metric screw in brass, fine. But if I want to understand if that's the right screw to use in that situation, they can't help me out. So what tends to happen when you look at Home Depot online and you look at other stores, really poor reviews because the level of interactive value is so diminished relative to what we expect to have.
What would be your counsel to companies that are having a really, really difficult time with that?
So one of the things we found is we had this model of 7 variables, and one of them is, do your executives lean in? I mean, really lean in daily. So organizations that were thriving, their executives were spending about 17.4 hours a week on this whole idea of digital transformation. It's just over 2 days, right? Maybe even 3 for some execs. If you don't take this seriously, you're not going to get serious return. The second thing, and I really believe this very deeply from the data, is you have to spend time with customers where customers are comfortable talking to you. Bringing people into focus groups doesn't work. Bringing people into a room in an office and talking doesn't work. You've got to follow them around, right? You've got to understand that screw conversation and say, hey, what would have made it better? What would have made it easier? What would have made it interesting? Many executives are frightened about doing that because they've lived a life of incrementalism. How do I make this 1%, 2%, 3% better versus how do I make it radically different? Because they're paranoid about changing their infrastructure. So spend the time invested in the process 2 or 3 days a week. Don't do focus groups. Really talk to customers. Really get in their faces and have real human conversations. And I think that most of the companies that fail, seen it in retail, I frankly think we're seeing it with Boeing now, and we've seen it with other industrial organizations, they're not spending time with customers. They're not literally living in their clothing, living in their office. You can't succeed unless you live with a customer. It's just not possible.
So I think, you just gave the example of focus groups because that is like super common. Like when you're doing market research, right? Focus groups. And I've been in many of them at other companies. And sometimes, yeah, you're right. Sometimes it's just you're getting a snapshot in time. And sometimes it can be very misleading based on types of questions you're asking. And so you have to be very, very careful with the focus groups. But I like how you're going with this about the key here is getting to know the customer. And it means spending time with them. It means building relationships
all the time,
with them.
right? It's all the time. You shouldn't be. The problem with focus groups is not the design or the intent, is that this is extraordinary laser-like focus on answering one question. And knowledge is not gained in 45 minutes with a $50 coupon and a nice cup of coffee and sandwiches. It's got from being with people the whole time. And we often say to execs, look, if you want to really understand how a CIO or a CMO or a CEO is thinking, you've got to be with them. And you've got to look at multiple sources of information. We call this themes and streams. and you have to work out which pieces work where and how, because your job is to make a jigsaw puzzle where there is no pattern. Focus groups are designed to find a pattern in a specific area, but knowledge is rarely gained that way. It's gained through leaning in a curious intent and just trying to understand that journey effectively.
I want to go back because you said something really interesting when I was asking you about your background, and you were saying how I think you're around your 30s, you had been so focused on making sure that the company was optimized in marketing and in business, and basically, squeezing every dollar that you could out of every single thing. And at some point, you were kind of like asking yourself, like, what is the purpose of all this? Like, right. And you're kind of going through that stage that many of us go through. And you started to rethink about, what do I want to be doing with my career? Can you go back there and kind of take us through your thought process to what led you to then focus in on digital transformation?
I think two things. I actually know both physical moments. I was just thinking as you asked me. The first thing is we built a subscription computing model at Micron. It's one of the first three that ever ran. And it was not leasing. It said, hey, you take a relationship with us for life. We'll supply you with this technology with a monthly fee, which is now the common existence of both businesses. And I just realized at the time, forcing that level of radical change on a system that was trying to squeeze less and less was an almost impossible process. It'd be like me trying to fit into medium or small clothing. It just isn't going to happen, and I'll burst out of the seams. So I think you have to recognize, if you have to spend your whole life facing those conflicts time and time again, you either fail, you give up, or you minimize the objective outcomes because you try and succeed, but you drew to the height of the ceiling. It was particularly true. We were spending very large sums of money on marketing, $150 million a year.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's an incredible sum of money, but even by modern standards, because it was a transaction engine, and you could see very quickly what were the 2 or 3 channels customers were using back in sort of 2000, 2001, were multiplying almost exponentially overnight. So volume wasn't going to do it for you. And the idea of, hey, I can be optimized here, non-optimized there, was like saying, well, I'm bleeding in 4 places. I'll stop bleeding in 2. We can still bleed out in the other 2. So I just felt it was a sort of Gordian knot moment. I remember sitting in my office going, we need to break the Gordian knot here. We're not going to untie it. We need to slash it with a knife. Because we're going to be fine, but we need to radically shift the engine process. And you recognize very quickly that's the challenge that most executives should be having at some point in their career, that they need to recognize, because you either get shifted into incrementalism or you get shifted into positioning. I'll position myself for the next thing, or I'll incrementalize myself to be a good operator. And it just doesn't function successfully. And it's very easy to say 5, 10, 15, 20 years out, I've been an incrementalist, or I've politically set myself up properly. I didn't want to do that. I really wanted to change the world, because people's jobs depend on leaders to change the platform they work from. Because if you can't change that platform, then you're also asking your people to be measured on a lifetime of incrementalism, which I just don't think is what we as a species are meant to be doing. So once we'd understood that incrementalism wasn't going to get me there, to be selfish and others, I recognize you needed to make dramatic differences. You need to break that Gordian knot, not try and untwist it. So I first of all did it with a marketing design engine that showed people how to basically mix physical and online, how to look at content sequencing, sort of what I call engrams. Did it globally, very successful company sold it. We then did the same for social media. And the social media thing is that second moment, because what you recognize is that social in itself solves far more than likes, dislikes, retweets, whatever. It's actually a moment for collaboration, co-collaboration, sharing of insight, good and bad. And that, to me, back in 2013 was the sort of spark that set off the whole digital transformation process. How do we connect people together digitally so they can be better versions of themselves? Now, at one end you have Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, but the other end actually is social collaboration work style. And at the same time, technology and bandwidth was allowing us not just put stuff in a building, but to have it in a building somewhere that we all shared. And you could see these enormous ripples changing the way companies functioned. It wasn't just, hey, we've got this many servers and this much technology. It's like, well, we've had 50,000 collaborative moments in the company this month. Look what it's produced. Look at the experiments. Look at the ideas. Look at the customer interaction. And I think that digital transformation in itself is, look, let's re-engineer the company. Let's re-engineer the business model. Let's not worry about scale, but worry about scale, innovation, and efficiency. Let's worry about the idea of not serving 10 segments, but serving 7 billion segments, which is a really interesting idea, because if we can all make ourselves the best versions of ourselves at work and at home as consumers, I think we'd probably produce a better planet and a better economy. So the idea became very appealing. The problem was, it's a $2 trillion industry. It's about the size of the Italian economy and a lot more efficient. There was no framework for it. So people either spend a lot of money on technology, they try to re-engineer processes, and we said, no, look, there are 7 interactive components here. If you get these right, guess what? You're going to be successful with it. And much like the Blue Ocean strategy work, it gave people an understanding of process, technology, thinking, design, and action. That means you could convert a company like Rubbermaid, or you could convert a business like, hopefully, Boeing in the future, and actually make it relevant to the 21st century. So instead of trying to put a steam engine in a sailing ship, which is what most people were doing, you actually get to build a real steamship with a real steam engine that can hold capacities far past that we've ever seen before.
You touch on social collaboration, and that is like super, super important, like within the company, like getting teams, especially if you have silos within the organization, getting teams talking together. And I'm kind of curious about, as you have been doing all this research, talking with different companies, what are some examples of companies that are doing a really good job, like improving the collaboration with employees across their different businesses? And are they using any sort of technology to help them with that?
So the answer to that is, I think, Steelcase and USAA. People probably know who Steelcase are. They're one of the largest office furniture manufacturers in the world. And USAA, which is basically ex-military service individuals insurance, house, car, everything, based in San Antonio. They both portray 2 really interesting indicators of collaborative social culture. One is they spend a lot of time with customers, not in focus groups, but every individual has a fundamental responsibility to understand on an ongoing basis how the customers behave. So silly example at USAA, they have this social monitoring system. Everybody has access to it, good stuff, bad stuff. Everybody has to look at it every single day. So much as we might look at our own LinkedIn account.
Oh, wow.
Facebook, yeah, it's important because it's a living educational process. The insights come in, they should have opinions, questions, answers. And there's a commitment for at least 20 minutes, half an hour a day for every employee at every level to look at it.
Wow.
Some pay a lot more attention than others. But that's this nature of what we call theme and stream, is that we've got to get better at filtering value, whereas before we used to try and have to find it. There's a lot of value out there. You've got to be able to filter it properly. I think the second, if you look at Steelcase, is what I call collaborative design. They make steel, they bend it, they put screws in it, and it sits in an office, right? Okay. Office environment is probably evolving faster than anything we've ever seen. It's not just the we work discussion, but we've talked about, do you work at home? Do you work in an office? I've seen this increasing growth of telephone cubes. You may have seen them like Maxwell Smart. They're sort of 3 foot by 3 foot, and you can now have calls in there, but otherwise you're on an open plan floor. So that's a really organic growth process. This isn't the office environment of Mad Men in the 60s or terrible open plan concrete offices in the 90s. So they spend a lot of time playing, literally playing with customers on design process, on the argument as well. We have an idea, but if we work with customers on a live basis and ongoing, they're going to make it better than we are. They're going to tell us if bolts fit or certain panels don't work. And I think that investment in learning and collaborative design is frankly infinitely more powerful than investing in marketing, because we can throw a dart at a target, but collaborative design really allows for almost surgical level of precision. Then you think about the supply chain that goes with it. So whether or not it's USA saying, hey, I know there's going to be a storm in your area tonight, it's really bad, make sure you have this number, preemptive, or Steelcase really understanding not what the cost of entry for furniture is, but what the differentiating value is in screws or materials and cloth in certain situations. We need to let go of self-serving design and open up to collaborative process. And the social that we started tracking 13, 14 was really indicating this really early on, that the companies that got that were just better at margin, net promoter scores, loyalty scores. And it wasn't just their own preceptor, like you could see it in secondary data. And the act of letting go and collaborating is the essence of successful digital transformation. And that's really tough for control-centric executives that either like a matrix model where they're in the center, or a pyramid model where they're generally at the top. And that's just not going to be the way it's going to work for millennials or younger people in 10, 20 years time.
I think it's really cool that a lot more companies are beginning to think about ways to improve collaboration with employees. And just at Experian in the last couple of years, they've launched a lot of different executive resource groups around. We have Hispanic heritage groups, we have African American groups, we have the Pride Network, we have Women in Experian, and all these networks have been a great way for us to begin to collaborate. People are able to meet others in different business units, and I found it to be super useful. But you touched on something that is actually a huge challenge, and that is for those employees that work at home. And I'm curious about those companies that are trying to just improve social collaboration and discussions within employees. When you have and as more and more companies are beginning to have more people work from home, because there's a lot of benefits, right? You save on office space, and then the employees are sometimes happier. They don't have to drive
Well,
to
they
work
also
every
tend to
single
work
day.
really long hours. I mean, the history of
Right, yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
you get an extra 10, 12 hours a week out of an employee, unfortunately, because they work at home.
Yeah, sometimes there's a problem with that because it starts to blur between life and work. And the moment you get on, obviously, I check my email really quickly, and then an hour goes by. And so there could be definitely some problems if that time's not managed properly. But I'm wondering about, I feel like for those employees that are working from home and they're not in the office seeing people day to day, and they're not able to go to these different functions and events on
Mhm.
campus, they're missing out on a lot. But there seems to be this trend of more people working from home, which can be good, but then they're lacking out on that kind of in-person collaboration.
Yeah. So there's a couple of ways to think about it. I think first off, you look at LinkedIn, you look at Facebook, you look at all these social devices. These collective groups should not be defined in their physical presence. Although it's lovely to be in a room where you're talking to single parents, right? And you suddenly recognize the incredible challenges they have to sustain and grow a career and have kids. It's like mind blowing. They need to live primarily on a social environment. It's frequent, it's diverse by nature, and it has lots of different varying forms of communication. If they so happen to be physical too, I think it's very good. But we all spend our time looking, observing. Sort of think of it as a stadium, right? If you're in an NFL game, there are what, 90,000 people in a stadium. There's probably 3,000 people on the 50-yard line. And in the coaching box, there's 50 people. That doesn't mean the 90,000 people in the stadium that are not in those positions don't get to see, observe, and be part of the process. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why looking for the best common denominators to encourage everybody to be part of it is vital. Yes, you could pay the money for the 50-yard ticket, the lunch brown box event. Or if you're really, really lucky, you get in a small collective one evening, go out for a meal and discuss stuff. That's the coaches on the sideline. But you have to find those large, commonly used vehicles, because 30 seconds with somebody every day about racial, gender diversity is far more powerful than just one 30-minute session a year or a month. And that's one of the challenges that HR, I think, has, is understanding how to use those social engines as part of this process, the primary engine, not just as an after effect of, hey, we had a lunch, here's a message. So, broadcasting live in these events, having people that blog, socially share, having rules about sharing it, encouraging people to share is a different priority for HR. And I think they struggle with it badly, but it's an essential way of connecting with people at home. Your and my comments at home should be as valuable as they are in an office. But if we create an equal environment versus, oh, I'm on the phone from home and I'm on the phone in the office, we rebalance out that power struggle. So we see everybody in the stadium, not necessarily on the 50-yard line or in the coach's box. And that's a really important thing we learned 6 years ago. So one of the models we have in the books is, look, everybody's responsible to each other equally all the time. And that reduction or removal of that hierarchy and environment process is vital for success.
I love that. I love your the football metaphor. I think that's a really good way to put it, and I like that a lot because I do feel, especially for those who are not in the workplace, they're working from home. They're definitely in the stands looking in,
Oh,
and how
yeah.
do you get them participating? Through the use of technology. I like your examples of social blogging, having other people tell the stories, video technology, and this comes to like a company's investment into those tools
Yes.
help improve employee collaboration. Because I've been at companies where those tools that are supposed to be there to help us collaborate are terrible, right? You like
Well,
log in, you're
they're
like,
a tick list item. You buy them because you have to.
yeah,
We should say for every dollar you spend on the technology, you've got to spend $3 on training and activation. But trust me, none of those tool companies will tell you that, because then what looks like a $200,000 deal starts to look like $1 million in real investment. But that's where the differentiating value has to be for a company, is all my people working together fluidly as much as possible. A lot of these academics now talk about adaptive IQ as well as EQ and IQ generally. Your adaptive capacity is going to be a key definer for the next 10 years. Companies have to help us be adaptive about dealing in an omni-channel world, not just saying if you're in the office, you win. If you're at home, you're peripheral and you're in row C312. It's an interesting example. Green Bay Packers play roll out the barrel at the end of the third quarter. Doesn't matter what the score is, all right? Everybody in the stadium gets to sing this song, Roll Out the Barrel. It's a really old World War I song. It's amazing how people get into it, right? Because it's a moment that's going to happen. It's incredibly shared, and it's utterly traditional for them versus anybody else.
That's cool. I didn't know about that.
It brings everybody in from row 312 all the way down to the bench on the field. And having those common moments that are omni-channel in nature is really vital part of building an adaptive environment where we respect people for the ideas and the fact they lean in, not their seniority or gender or color or experience, because we all have really good moments and elements that can make a much better solution than just one person's grand idea that everybody has to execute.
I like that. I never heard that term. Adaptive. Is it adaptive?
Adaptive. Well, so there's EQ, IQ, and AQ. There's sort of adaptive quotient, and it is, as I said, millennials are going to have 15 careers. If you ask kids now in Generation Z how many jobs they're going to have, they're like, I have no idea, but it's a lot more than my brother, a millennial. It's clearly a lot more than my father, my grandfather. So once you get to that level of volume, you have to be adapted to do that. You can't make 15 career decisions. You have to have sort of like a fluid flow that goes through it.
Yeah, I like that. It's really hard is when you are a type of person that likes to adapt and likes change and can evolve and wants to try out new things. The trouble is when the technology doesn't work right. That's the frustrating part. Right? That's like the frustrating thing. Like they bring in. Even I remember even back in the day when they first brought in like a video chat tool like we're using, and it just didn't. It worked like half the time.
It was terrible. It took an hour to set up for 15 minutes of shaky film, and you really were like, I could have done that on a telephone call. But that's just a natural issue, right? Our aspiration always will exceed our capability, but hopefully aspiration pulls capability along. Look, let's look at direct database marketing, right? And you guys are, historically very powerful in it. Where that has come over 20 years is very clear, but it's been a very long journey to get to the point where I'm not getting emails that I don't want, or I'm getting emails about things that I don't like from people I don't want. But we've not quite got to that level of personalization yet that allows that form of direct marketing to really live up to the promise. Oh yeah, you can have one-to-one conversations. But we have to keep moving in that direction in order to get that promise to happen. And I think same in collaboration. I'd argue the two biggest barriers right now to developing people is the HR function, because it's still locked into compliance and governance. And it's executives that think that they're going to produce other versions of themselves in employees that are less than 30 years old. And they're not. The assumptions, the intellectual skills, the emotional and AQ skills are radically different than people that are in the boomer population. And unfortunately, HR has become, not deliberately but by accident, a barrier to that evolutionary process, because they're still locked into compliance and governance. And they don't get rewarded on what's the level of development your staff have had this year. If you look at Department X, how much better is that department as people intellectually, emotionally, adaptively than they were last year? No company measures its people that way. We're going to have to do it in order to make this happen. We have carbon emissions because it tells us how much danger the planet's in. We should have metrics in HR that talk about how lowly adaptive people are, or how low they are on emotional, or where they're challenged on basic IQ. We've got to really understand that stuff, because we can't get people somewhere unless we really know where they are. And it's not the old measures of, did they get work done on time, right? Were they too expensive? Were they leaving for other reasons? That's all important, but that's not going to help you develop a better business organizational style.
When you talk about how the millennial might have 15 different jobs, like when I think about that, I think
scary.
It is scary. It's like, I feel like there's a miss there, because companies aren't able to retain them. Because I feel like if a company can bring in somebody who's talented, who does really good work, there should be like this career track that this person could be on. But no, you're saying.
Yeah, and again, I use football as an analogy because we work with two teams or three of it originally. One of the things I've learned is teams are never forever. Players come in and go out. There's this classic 4-year cycle that most teams actually, if they're good, like the Seahawks or the Packers and some others have kept to, certainly the Patriots. I think executives need to look at their people going, how do I make them the best version of themselves in a shortest possible time frame? If they stay, they stay. But we're going to constantly need to be reviewed and review them for whether or not they fit the organizational style. The more adaptive I make them, probably the longer they'll stay. And those other variables that matter will be performance-based. But I don't believe a job is for life. I don't believe employees believe that. And if organizations believe that, then we would have already been teaching people to be highly adaptive. And we just haven't. Trade unions haven't done a good job. Governments haven't done a good job. Corporations haven't. GE, to me, is a perfect example of where the precepts set up by Welch no longer really apply about being in the top 3. They didn't have enough employees saying, hold it, that's just a bad model. So I think organizations succeed by making the people they hire better versions. So by the time they leave, someone says, I did a great job there. I learned a lot. You should maybe consider going to work there, particularly given things like Indeed, Glassdoor. They're really powerful ways of indicating success. But you've got to think about teams having a natural life cycle. Could be a little smaller, could be a little larger, but you have to manage through a life cycle. You can't talk about jobs forever. It's just not logical, right? It's like saying, I'd like to keep a horse in an apartment. You're not going to be able to keep a horse in an apartment. You might be able to borrow a horse at weekends to ride, but just the real estate and the capital models don't allow us to hire people for life. I'm not suggesting the McKinsey model where they cut a quarter of the staff every year and bring in new. But you've got to understand that certain people may have worked well for you now. They may be adapting out to something new, or they may be able to adapt to something new internally. But this smooth pathway of, level H, I, J, K, or A, B, C, D, E just doesn't exist anymore.
It's interesting that you talk about like the team lifespan is typically maybe 3 to 4 years. And I like how you even brought it back to sports. I'm like, oh yeah, it's so true. Like within sports teams, like, you have a good group of players, and then people, get injured or they leave the team, and then
they make too much money, right?
They make too much money. And then
why should you damage your body at $60 million?
Yeah,
you've probably only got actively 3 years left, and it's maybe shown in a catch that's not quite reached for, or a tackle that's not quite hard in. Professional sport is very tough, and it's not just football in this country. It's soccer, women's soccer, basketball, all have this life cycle. So you have to teach people how to be really efficient and effective in that life cycle and not just try and unnaturally stretch it. Look at the NFL. Kickers reach a wall. Adam Vinatieri, you reach a wall and you plummet down. Well, that plummeting down happens in every other position. How many catchers in baseball have ever been really successful after the age of 28? Johnny Bench is probably the only one, just because the body can't keep up to the pressures of the game past a certain age. And the same is true in work as well.
I think that's it's so true. And it's funny, as I've been, I was sharing with you that we host another podcast on leadership. And when I do a lot of research on leaders and I look at their LinkedIn profiles, which tells you a lot about their career journeys, I tend to notice that some of the best leaders move in different roles, like every 2 to 3 years. Like they'll be in a role in their learning, they're growing, they're changing the organization, improving things, optimizing, and then all of a sudden, around that 2, 3, sometimes 4-year mark, they're moving because there's like a new opportunity for them. And sometimes it's within the same company, like there's a new role in a different area.
So actually, if you were to pick, it's interesting.
And I guess these people, are more the boomer age.
You can see millennials too. So we work with Forbes on the podcast. They have this thing called the under 30 list, and most of these under 30s are clearly highly entrepreneurial self-starters, but you then start looking at the upper age category, and some of them have gone to work in companies. They've learned and they've left and they've done something else. It's very difficult to move up progressively in one company and find something different. It's the old adage, if you want an increase in salary, change who employs you. If you want an increase in experiences, you probably can't do it in the same frame because it's still the same basic culture, same basic framework and story. You can optimize X more than somebody else may have done, but that is not a healthy way of succeeding.
That's so interesting. That's so interesting.
We are
This is
our own
all.
self-agents. At some point, we will all be our own companies. I mean, effectively, because labor either gets replaced by AI and automation, what's valuable will change over time. And frankly, what our personal needs are going to be as we get better and better marketplaces to match supply and demand will evolve over time. What we are now isn't hopefully what we were 10 years ago, or maybe 10 years in the future.
What's your advice for this next generation coming up as they're choosing their first job or their first jobs?
So
Because
there's a piece we wrote in Forbes that said, look, before you take a job, ask your employer 3 questions. All right. A dog's about to come behind me, so I apologize. Oh, yeah,
go for it.
Hello, little boy.
Oh, sweet dog.
He's very gorgeous, right? We say, ask your company how successful they are at digital transformation. Is this organization's leadership actually capable of investing 17 and a half hours a week on this subject? If they say, no, I don't know, that's not a good place to go and learn, right? Are they significantly investing in reskilling and training? If they're not, it's probably not a good place to learn. What company gives its people pensions anymore, right? We all get roughly the same amount of time off. So the traditional distinguishing factors are no longer the ones that matter. Those issues of how you're transforming, how committed is your leadership to the process, is just a really big deal.
And what suggestions do you have as you've been watching and as you are thinking and making predictions about what work will look like 10 years from now, or maybe even 20 years from now, for those of us that want to be constantly evolving and adapting and being ready for the various transformations that are happening? What are some things, some skills, some things that people can be doing to kind of ready themselves to be the best that they can be?
So I think 3 questions. One is get comfortable getting uncomfortable, because if you don't get comfortable getting uncomfortable, it doesn't matter what I say next, won't make a difference. Second, you've got to be curious. I think you've got to recognize that the world is going to be different, and you should think about, what do I need to develop and evolve to get there? Again, I can't solve that issue, but curiosity does it. Third, you've got to take some risks, right? Whether or not you're going to learn to code in Python, or you're going to learn to, speak multiple languages, you have to say, what am I learning this week? What did I leave the day learning new and different? I think if you set yourself that daily goal of learning question, you're going to be fine, because I can't predict the future, but I can predict that the future is really different than now. So unless you learn to be adaptive, emotionally capable, and sort of learn to develop your IQ, it's tough to be successful, period. If you ask the CEO about AI, 97.5% of them say, oh, we're really committed to it, right? We really get it. We know it's the future. If you then say to them, how successful have you been? Less than 20% actually say they've been successful. And what's going to scare you is half of them say, no, actually, we've lost money doing it. In fact, it's cost us more than we do. If you then say to them, hey, what sort of languages are you programming? How are you doing it? What does deep learning mean? They go blind, right? So that this desire to buy into the future means you've got to go deeper into learning than I think most execs want to do. They just want to use the packaging language. Individually, you shouldn't do that. So if you really are interested in being a data scientist or understanding data, you got to learn Python, right? So there are basic requirements to step into this new world that people need to be comfortable making that commitment to, whether or not it's at weekends or in evenings. You have to have a sort of growth mindset. And Satya at Microsoft, as you know, has talked a lot about this need to sort of be honest about what you don't know and be curious about it, to be obstinate and enforce that what you know is right, because that's the old world. That's the Jack Welch, we've always got to be in the top 3 in a segment world. That's not the new world that's happening to everyone. It's not just in the Western Europe, it's in Asia, it's in Africa. The whole world is moving to this, like, if you don't learn how to learn, it's going to be difficult how to be successful, because you can manufacture anywhere. You and I could set up a plant that does 3D plastic toys by 5 o'clock this evening. That was never possible 5 years ago. So the ability to execute is easy. The ability to design and sort of learn is really difficult. And that's what we have to get into, is a learning mentality about how to make these things better, both personally and organizationally.
That's great advice. Michael, before we go, can you talk a little bit about can we talk about your podcast?
Yeah, so Forbes were great. They let me play. And what the idea was, basically only about 19% of people actually think about the world of 10 years from the future. And they only think about it once a week, which isn't a lot of time, given that 98% of us will still be around in 10 years' time. So we've gone off and interviewed everybody that's, we interviewed the chief food scientist at the number 2 restaurant in the world in Spain about how she thought about 3D food, printed food in her restaurant, right? Because that's not a typical fine dining experience, right? We've talked to a company that's dealt with 3D printing organs, Prelis Biologics, literally kidney, liver system printed in hours, right? So you could have a 4th or 5th act. We've talked to companies like ABB that talk about, or ABB, how they're going to re-engineer buildings to be sensitive to people that walk in for literally specific environmental concerns for them. We've talked to one of, I think, the best vegan dairy companies in the world, Maker China, who literally is helping farmers migrate from selling milk dairy product to selling vegetable-based dairy product. We've talked to big social change agents like David Bray, who basically used to work as an Eisenhower Foundation Fellow. But it's designed to understand what the possible worlds of 10 years can look like and how it should feel to people. So we even talked to a company that specialized in cloning animals. They actually cloned Barbra Streisand's dogs. And we just talked about what the social implications of cloning would be. Instead of it costing $50,000, it may only cost $5,000. What would we do with our favorite pets or horses or animals? And how could that even affect the way we think about farming systems? So the stuff is a little out there in a good way. We talked to a guy who has 3D food printing, and his number 1 client is NASA. So as they're going to Mars, he's going to put 3D printers on basically spaceships. It sort of feels like Star Trek. We've talked to people at AT&T about what 5G really could mean in 3 or 4 years' time in terms of 3-dimensional holograms in front of us, sort of the baby Star Wars. We're very close to some really unique forms of transportation, food, technology that we can start using in ways that we never thought could be used before. They're really passionate, interesting. Some of them are small individual organizations, some are really big, but those that seem to want to lean into the future, to me, have the highest chance of being successful because they're curious about what could happen and how it could be put together.
So cool. Have there been any things you've after you've done the show, you're really excited about that idea of what could happen in the future?
I think the problem is I can't find one that isn't exciting, right? So even, we talk about water supply systems, right? How are we going to deal with different water supply systems? We talked to a very famous climatologist, a New Zealander who actually had to move from the US to Canada in order to get funding. And he is one of the biggest experts in hydrology ever. And even he's optimistic about what could happen if a few things occur. And I just think we're at that point in history. It's sort of like the Age of Great Enlightenment or the start of Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It's the age of lightness, age of darkness, where we have to make some conscious decisions to adapt stuff. Some of these ideas appear fairly small. We interviewed somebody this week who talks about women's bra design. It's not a small issue. It's a big issue for 51% of the population, but how there's a revolution occurring in the way we design and build bras for women for tissue support. Obviously, for you and I, that's not a big deal, but for over half the world's population, it's a huge challenge because the industry has been so dominated by fashion versus function. She's talking about how they can build 3D printing systems and design supply chains that could allow you to build and fit a bra in a store, and it's ready for you on the spot versus you have to buy one of 12 sizes because no human being ever fits into one of those 12 sizes too. So I think they're all really interesting ideas that are practically much more viable than say 5 to 10 years ago, because if you digitally transform, all those systems connect together so you can imagine new worlds that were never practical a while ago.
Awesome. And where can people go to subscribe to this show?
Yeah, just go to Forbes, just type in Futures in Focus. It runs on the website, which is great because it's a hugely populated sort of daily website in the US. You can certainly drop me an email at michael@ink.digital, connect with me on LinkedIn. But it's a super findable, I think very listenable podcast because of the guests. You just ask them 2 or 3 questions and people go, much like today. It's really well moderated conversation.
Super cool. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being a guest on Data Talk.
Oh, it's been great today. Nice to be there. There's great questions too, and I hope listeners and viewers find it useful.
Hey everybody, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Data Talk podcast. We share out new episodes every single week, and you can find a full catalog of previous shows, including YouTube videos, on our Experian news blog. The URL is just experian.com/datatalk. And as always, we always look forward to hearing from our community. So if you have suggestions for topics or guests you'd like to hear from, please let me know. You can always reach out to us on Twitter at Experian Data Lab, or you can reach out to me directly On LinkedIn, you can search for Michael Delgado, or you can email me at michael.delgado@experian.com. Hope you have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll chat next week.